Michael Rubens Bloomberg was not born into privilege the way many billionaires are often imagined to be, and while his name today resonates with power, philanthropy, media influence, and a mayoral legacy, his beginnings were simple, almost ordinary, and yet filled with a kind of quiet determination that only life's early tests can forge. Because Bloomberg's story does not start with inherited wealth or glamorous opportunities, but in the modest neighborhood of Medford, Massachusetts, where his parents, William and Charlotte, instilled in him the values of hard work, discipline, and resilience, values that would later become the bedrock of his monumental journey. And growing up in a middle-class household meant Michael knew the value of every dollar earned. He watched his father work long hours as a bookkeeper at a dairy company, never making more than $9,000 a year in his life. And yet never once complaining, never once asking for sympathy, instead showing by example that dignity in work, no matter how humble, mattered more than status. And his mother Charlotte, who was strong-willed, practical, and unafraid to speak her mind, became a constant source of emotional grounding, reminding young Michael that success in life was less about where you start and more about how fiercely you commit to where you want to go. And while many kids dreamed only of fun and play, Michael began noticing early the little details about money, leadership, and responsibility that others overlooked, often reflecting on how his family had to budget carefully, how nothing was wasted, and how opportunities weren't given but created. And as a boy he took odd jobs, from shoveling snow to working as a parking lot attendant, learning firsthand that sweat was the real price of progress, not shortcuts, not entitlement. And in these moments, the first seeds of grit were planted in him. Because he realized early that comfort zones never produce greatness, and that struggle, though uncomfortable, was a teacher far more valuable than ease. And in school Michael was intelligent but not extraordinary in a flashy way. Instead, he was curious, persistent, someone who refused to be outworked, and he quickly grasped that leadership wasn't about being the loudest in the room but about being consistent, reliable, and ready to act when others hesitated. And by the time he attended Johns Hopkins University, he already carried that quiet fire. Majoring in electrical engineering, he pushed himself academically while also working jobs to support himself. And it was in college that the idea of building something beyond himself started taking root, because the environment of brilliant minds, competition, and ambition sparked in him a deep hunger to not just exist in the world but to shape it, to leave a mark, to matter in a way that would outlast his name. And his time at Johns Hopkins was not easy. He had to stretch himself constantly. He wasn't the top student naturally gifted in every subject, but he was the one who stayed longer, read harder, and refused to quit. And this resilience paid off when he earned his degree and then went on to Harvard Business School, an environment where ambition wasn't the exception but the air everyone breathed. And here, Bloomberg polished his raw determination into strategy, learning not only about finance, economics, and management but about the psychology of decision-making, the nuances of risk, and the importance of vision. And while Harvard exposed him to networks and opportunities, it didn't hand him success. What it gave him was the confidence that he could survive among the sharpest, that he could thrive even when the room was full of people more experienced, wealthier, or connected. And this realization, that his background didn't limit him, became a lifelong mindset, a belief that no obstacle was final unless he accepted it as such. And with his MBA in hand, Bloomberg entered Wall Street in the 1960s, joining Salomon Brothers, an investment bank where the culture was intense, competitive, and merciless. And for a young man without family ties in finance, it was sink or swim. And true to his nature, Bloomberg chose to swim, starting in the equities department, working brutally long hours, often doing tasks that others considered beneath them, yet he did them with precision, energy, and enthusiasm, quickly gaining a reputation as someone who could be counted on to deliver, someone who didn't just meet expectations but often exceeded them. And in an industry where many were obsessed with titles, Bloomberg obsessed over performance, over learning, over how to make systems better. And it was this mindset that began setting him apart, because while others were climbing for immediate recognition, Bloomberg was building foundations, absorbing knowledge about the inner mechanics of markets, about technology's role in finance, about how information was power, and how those who could access and interpret it faster would always win. And though at that time he could not yet see the full picture of the empire he would one day build, the early sparks of his later Bloomberg terminal were already flickering in his mind, because he noticed that traders wasted time searching for information scattered across multiple sources, and he thought to himself, what if all this data could be streamlined, accessible, actionable, and packaged in a way that empowered decisions instantly? And though he didn't yet have the platform to execute it, he carried the idea with him, nursing it quietly as he proved himself, rising steadily through Salomon Brothers until he became a general partner by his late 30s, a remarkable achievement for someone who had started with no connections, and yet life, as it often does, threw him an unexpected test. In 1981, after nearly 15 years at the firm, Michael Bloomberg was suddenly fired, not because he had failed, but because the company was being acquired and his division was no longer considered essential. And for many people, being fired at 39 after giving their all to a company would have been a devastating, humiliating setback, a reason to retreat or settle for something smaller. But for Bloomberg, it became the catalyst, the moment that defined the rest of his life, because instead of wallowing in bitterness, he took his severance package, $10 million, and decided that this was not the end of his career but the beginning of his destiny. And, standing at that crossroads, he chose the harder path, the riskier one, the one that required courage, vision, and relentless work, and with that decision, the next chapter of his story, the creation of Bloomberg LP, the rise of a media empire, and the building of a legacy far greater than himself, was set into motion, and in this way, failure became his fuel, rejection became his redirection, and what most people would have seen as the death of a dream, Michael Bloomberg transformed into the birth of a legend. When Michael Bloomberg walked out of Salomon Brothers in 1981 with a cardboard box of his belongings and a severance package of $10 million, the world could have easily mistaken him for a man whose best years were behind him, a middle-aged executive cut loose from the institution that had defined his career. But deep inside he knew differently, because Bloomberg was not wired to accept endings as permanent. He was wired to treat them as beginnings, and that very moment, one that could have broken another person, was the spark of his greatest creation. The point where resilience collided with vision to ignite something historic, and rather than nursing bitterness, he immediately began sketching ideas for how he could reshape the financial industry itself. Because during his years at Salomon Brothers, he had noticed a glaring inefficiency that gnawed at him every single day. The way financial information was scattered, clunky, and inaccessible, forcing traders and bankers to waste precious time searching for numbers, piecing together fragments of data, and relying on outdated methods that slowed down decisions in a world where speed meant everything. And so he imagined a system, a machine, a platform that would unify, organize, and deliver real-time financial information in a way the industry had never seen before, and that idea became the blueprint of Bloomberg LP, a company that at its core was not about money alone but about information, about empowerment, about changing the very way markets functioned. And though the vision was grand, the beginnings were brutally humble, because with just 4 employees working out of a small office, Michael Bloomberg set out to build his dream, investing his own money into the venture, risking everything he had earned, and unlike many entrepreneurs who hesitate, who seek comfort, he dove headfirst, pouring long hours into product development, knocking on doors, pitching to people who barely knew his name, explaining again and again why his system mattered, and the skepticism was thick, because people were used to doing things the old way, and innovators are always ridiculed before they are respected. But Bloomberg had thick skin, honed by years of working under pressure, and he believed so strongly in his vision that no rejection could deter him, and slowly, painfully, progress began to show as the first iteration of his product, called the Market Master Terminal, was developed, a machine that provided users with real-time market data, analytics, and financial information that was previously either too slow or too scattered to be useful. And he knew that the product was revolutionary, but also that revolution means nothing without adoption. So he strategized carefully, focusing on winning one big client who would validate the idea and open the floodgates, and that client turned out to be Merrill Lynch, which in 1982 purchased 22 terminals and invested $30 million in Bloomberg LP, effectively launching the company from obscurity into legitimacy. And this partnership became the inflection point, because suddenly the financial world took notice. Suddenly Bloomberg wasn't just another fired banker with an idea. He was a founder with a proven product, and the demand began to rise, the terminals began spreading across Wall Street, and within a decade Bloomberg LP had become not just a company but a force, reshaping how financial data was consumed, empowering traders, analysts, and bankers to work with speed and accuracy that was unprecedented. And while the money began flowing in, Bloomberg never lost sight of the core philosophy. The business was not about terminals, it was about information, about leveling the playing field, about giving people the tools to make better decisions, and this philosophy resonated not just in finance but eventually in media. As Bloomberg expanded from data terminals to news, television, radio, and digital platforms, building a media empire that extended his influence beyond Wall Street into the global conversation. And yet, behind the scenes, the early years were not glamorous. They were exhausting, relentless, filled with doubt and sacrifice, because building a company of that magnitude meant endless problem-solving, dealing with technical failures, managing employees who questioned the future, facing competitors who dismissed the product as a fad, and shouldering the pressure of knowing that if the idea failed, the blame would fall squarely on his shoulders. But Bloomberg thrived under this pressure, because he saw in every obstacle not a roadblock but a puzzle, and his engineering background, combined with his business acumen, allowed him to approach problems creatively, persistently, until solutions emerged. And as the company grew, Bloomberg's reputation grew with it. No longer just the man who had been fired, but now the man who had turned failure into the foundation of one of the most important companies in the financial world. And this transformation, from an unemployed executive to a visionary entrepreneur, sent a powerful message to anyone paying attention. That setbacks are not sentences, that what feels like the end can be the opening of a door you never knew existed, that resilience is the most important currency you can ever carry, and in living this truth, Bloomberg not only built wealth but began crafting a legacy that would extend far beyond business, because he was teaching by example that true heroes are not the ones who never fall but the ones who rise again, stronger, bolder, and determined to turn pain into power.